male children is that you had to learn to have a good seat on a horse by the age of, I don't know, 6 or 7. It was a long time ago, but it was pretty young. And you had to learn how to trail ride, lots of low branches, so if you don't know what you're doing, you know, your neck snaps as you ride your horse under a branch that's too low. And I said, but that seems very, very dangerous. And the man said, well, if he gets himself killed, who needs him? That was his own son. So there's a Darwinian attitude at work. The most powerful weapon of mass instruction of all of them is the artificial extension of childhood. Back at the end of the 19th century, and a little before that in Germany, after centuries of trying, the business, the military, the institutional, and the church leadership succeeded for the first time in history in imposing a centralized form of schooling. And while it might be argued that the urge for education is timeless and universal, you can't claim that for compulsory schooling of any sort, at any time, or any place. The only way you can sell that is either at bayonet point or by lying to people about what your intentions are. So there was no public knowledge of the radical utopian strategy that was gradually inserted in these school places. And the most radical of all was the artificial extension of childhood. That's a deliberate lengthening of the period of childish dependency. By 1909, this is very precise now, 4 years had been tacked onto childhood in the United States and similar periods in the other important countries. But in the United States, by 1909, 4 years had been added. Where do I get that very precise figure? From one of the major designers who added the 4 years, so it's pretty impeccable information. By 1960, 10 years had been added to childhood. By 2000, 20 years. In Washington, D.C., a couple of years ago, several very important foundations said that adolescence wasn't over until the age of 32. Now, if you recall this morning, I said adolescence doesn't exist. It was invented in 1902. This spectacular change in the contract with young people reached the point by the year 2000 that divisions of the United States government were publicizing a view that it might be possible to think that adolescence wasn't over until 40. I mean, these weren't, if I say these weren't radicals, they were as radical as anyone ever existed. But just as the U.S. government now is an extremely radical government that calls itself conservative, does anyone you know who is a conservative spend $750 billion more than they earn every year? Is that conservative? Do they attack people who haven't attacked them first? Are these conservative things? These are profoundly radical undertakings. But as Orwell showed in 1984, if you just assert something over and over again, most people say it must be true or he wouldn't say it. So, the tactics used to extend childhood are not hard to understand. And you don't have to do them because you homeschool. You remove the subject from adult company and you embed the subject in a succession of worlds of children. Now, what characterizes worlds of children is that they don't have much experience, but they do have a sense of power structure. So inside those worlds of children, some of them become authorities. They don't have information or experience, but they hammer home their point of view, and their followers accept that. I mean, you can create this climate of low-level madness by keeping children with other children, which I know seems to be the most natural thing in the world. Well, let me tell you something as an old man in his 70s. When I was a boy, and all the people I know were boys, nothing was more fascinating than the world of grown-up people, and you would drop your childhood friends in a second if you were taken in to some project run by older people. So that now that older people have become a kind of baggage on the world of the young, we really have an advanced state of insanity at work, because the young don't have much to teach one another. It's a way of wasting time pleasantly. So what I'm going through here is a list of things that create extended childhood. Then an environment of low-grade fear and anxiety is utterly essential. It was discovered a long time ago, centuries ago, that if you could impose a climate of low-level anxiety on people, they didn't breed very well. They didn't reproduce themselves. It became a population control mechanism to constantly stress out the poor in various parts of the world. The Brits were great at that. They invented the system. Then you want an environment filled with fantasy, illusion, and half-truths. Think of video games. Think of television. Think of films, which I must confess I'd rather watch film life than live life, but nevertheless I recognize that that's a disease. You demand that things be committed to memory that are deceitful, like how a bill becomes a law. So the kid walks around, or the young man or woman walks around with their head stuffed with inaccurate information that they can't use to negotiate the world or solve their problems. So they quit trying to use it. Then children grow older, but they never grow up. Under such a regime, generation after generation becomes more childish than the one preceding, because people schooled this way make immature parents themselves. This new form of institutional schooling doesn't concern itself with intellect or the means through which intellect engages the world. I spoke to you about this part, speaking and writing, because intellect isn't its primary mission. It's to make the population manageable. The most sensational product of the school formula has been to create a culture of children, something that never existed in planetary history. I mean, it's just, there aren't samples of it anywhere. It first is hammered home in northern Germany because they came upon these ideas first. And now it's spread throughout the civilized world. These ideas that I know are somewhat disturbing are the price you have to pay to jump into the school debate and to know what you're talking about. Now comes the elimination of principled people. They have to be exchanged for pragmatic people. You know, whatever works, you do. That's pragmatism. Principle is, this is a line I draw. You may not cross this line. Principled people are nowhere welcome in the civilized world for obvious reasons. They're full of opposition. And what you need to maximize your money or your power is to be flexible in every situation. But principled people aren't flexible. They have rules by which they live their lives, by which they choose their associations. A principled person will turn to the boss of the corporation and say, I'm sorry, I won't do that. Now, how many of those can you tolerate on your executive staff or even on the plant floor? You can't tolerate those people in this kind of an economy, and in a capitalist economy. And I'm not anti-capitalist, but certainly the diseases of capitalism are pretty clear. There's nothing wrong, though, with announcing that you have principles and values and pledging loyalty to them. You hear it all the time, these values announced. Except whenever practicality gets in the way, you throw your principle out. Kids see this almost immediately in schools. I mean, little people have this inbuilt sense of fair play. It's just universal, and they see the teacher says something and doesn't do it. Principal says something and doesn't do it. If liberty means anything, for instance, doesn't it mean you have the right to urinate when you feel like doing so? I don't know what Australian practice is, but let me tell you, in the United States, you can't urinate unless you do it in your pants. You can't urinate without being handed an official travel pass to the urinal. And if you're caught without the travel pass, you're in hot water. In this instance, the liberty principle, which we pay lip service to, is forced to defer to the practical principle of traffic management. You want to know where these people are at every moment. Or even to the priority of a teacher's need to get even, to get revenge on a kid who's driving him crazy. It's the sheer volume of these instances decided against principle and for pragmatics during a 12-year stint in school, which instructs the student most powerfully about what's really to be honored in real situations. The forced confinement aspect of schooling, together with the arbitrary nature of the power exerted there, is an effective weapon of mass instruction used to prevent morality from sinking deep roots. As I told you a minute ago, you're expected to pay lip service to it, to nod your head and cluck your tongue. You're just not expected to insist on a principle when there's real work to be done. Think of 50 million children in the United States every day forbidden to finish what they're working on when the bell rings, in order to feel the magnitude of amorality at work in the school institution. Does 12 years of being interrupted set up a destructive pattern in you? Of course it does. You don't ever feel that finishing something you start is important. Then the newspaper can write about these people seem to be indifferent to good work. They need more time in school. A second source of school-weakened morality is the quantity of morally ambiguous imagery that school implants in an individual student's mind. Moral principles brought to school mutate into something strange in the Darwinian mill pond of schoolrooms. I'll give you one example of that, although I have a list of about 20 here. Bullying is winked at all over the civilized world. Of course, bullying is the exclusive cause of all the school shootings in the United States. And those facts have been abundantly teased out. Well, I worked 30 years inside some pretty good schools, and I can tell you that the bullies are let alone. If they're talked to at all as soon as the victim is out of the room, or mother is, there's a wink and you say, hey, Bob, you know, you can't do that. It's exactly the way prisons operate. There's a wonderful book about total institutions. The author's Irving Goffman, Goffman, and the book's Asylum. And it says you can't run an insane asylum or a prison or a school without joining in league with the most dangerous part of the imprisoned or the insane. You have to cut the people who are the leaders slack, and the leaders are the bullies. So kids see that. They see that there's no help appealing to the teacher. Because if the teacher, any teachers in here, by the way, could I see your hand if you're a teacher? There's just a few. If you end up sending too many people to the discipline office, you will end up without a job, regardless of the justice of that. And I think that in the culture of schooling, teachers figure that out pretty quickly. So, and the better the school is, the more what I'm saying is true. It can't be a secret to you that the elite private boarding schools, the bullies run the show. There are classics in literature about that. Tom Brown's School Days is one that comes to mind. So think of what's going on here. Creating childish people who have no deeply grounded morality. They're like robot soldiers, and they've been used for several centuries to rule the world economically and militarily. Think what a nightmare it is for an army commander who has to deal with moral troops. I mean, they may fight, they may not. They may argue, no, you want people who in exchange for a gold star will kill anybody. In the New World Order that's happening as we sit here, though, it seems to me that competition will never be one-sided again. Britain and the United States and Germany aren't ever going to rule the world again in a productive sense. It's not going to happen. And by dumbing down millions of people, it seems to me that we're committing a kind of suicide, throwing away our power, our imagination, our moral strength in order to keep things as they are as long as possible. Let me give you an example of that, and then I'm going to tell you about the trapped fleas strategy, which was taught to me 3 years ago by an 11-year-old boy. Maybe I better tell you about that first, because if I start ad-libbing, we're in trouble. 3 years ago, I got an award from an organization, and it was at a fancy hotel in Washington, D.C., and I found myself sitting next to an 11-year-old boy. He was a Taiwanese immigrant. I think his parents, I'm not 100% certain, but I think they were both waiters in Seattle, Washington. And I'm next to this 11-year-old boy who's getting the same award that I'm getting. What's he getting the award for? Well, he had just won the adult science fair in Washington State for sequencing the genes held in common between mice and human beings. That's an interesting little fella, right? The son of two waiters who immigrated from Taiwan and don't speak all that much English and don't have all that much money. He's 11 years old. So his name's Andrew Su, H-S-U. So in the course of having lunch, I said, Andrew, how did you get into your interest in sequencing genes in mice and human beings? And I'll never forget the first words out of his little mouth. He said, when I was little, he said, my father taught me how to train fleas. Does anybody here actually know about the long traditions, thousands of years old, of training fleas? It was a great favorite in courts in Europe and in Asia where the practice arose. And I actually got to watch a performance of trained fleas once. I mean, your jaw drops open. The fleas carry little whips, and they're whipping other fleas that are pulling chariots. They're swinging on trapezes. I mean, they're doing incredible things. Naturally, every few minutes you have to feed them by putting them on your arm, but I guess you do that. So how are you going to train fleas? When I tell you what Andrew told me, you'll instantly see that that's what I was hired to do for 30 years in New York schools. Andrew said, first you have to break their will. How do you break a flea's will? I didn't know a flea had a will. But the truth is, if you put fleas in everybody knows what a petri dish is, a little shallow dish, they will instantly jump out, and they'll head off in different directions. They actually have flea agendas, and they got business to conduct. You can't train fleas if you can't make them still. So how do you make them still? You put a lid on the petri dish, and you go away for about 3 hours. During that time, they constantly trying to go about their business. They're hitting their heads on the lid. When you come back, the fleas will be huddled together in an almost inert mass. When you take the lid off the petri dish, they won't ever try to get out again. You've broken their spirit by intervening in their own agendas. Does that sound like something that starts in kindergarten? I think so. And that's why I would urge you, if I fall dead or fall asleep before we get any farther in this, to build the curricula in your homeschools around some powerful interest your kid has. I don't mean not to teach math, science, the battery of different skills. Anything contains all those things simultaneously. It only takes a little bit of effort to find the mathematical dimension in that tripod and the camera that's up there, or in anything else. But don't put the lid on the Petri dish and say, and now for something different. Let him or her finish what they're doing. Don't make your homeschools subject-driven. Make them project-driven. It's night and day when you do that, because the end of a subject is a test, but the end of a project is something you can see, and you don't have to give it a grade. It grades itself. Do you give the barber or the beautician a grade? You look in the mirror and you either scream or say, not bad. You go to somebody else. All real things organically grade themselves. Let me put my specs back on. So, the trap-flea principle that Andrew knew by the age of 11 told him, these are his words, he said, as it is with fleas, so it is with life. This is this 11-year-old kid. Most of us, he said, let the impositions of others imprison us in a world of low expectations. Now, Andrew's not only a mouse gene sequencer, he's a championship swimmer with a lot of medals and trophies. His original language was Chinese, but he's fluent in French and English. He helps to make professional documentary films with a professional film crew in Seattle. I won't try to intimidate you. The stories this morning, these, I think, are universal properties of human beings. Don't ever fall for the bald-faced lie, well, that was a genius, or this, but that's out of ordinary reach. All these things are within ordinary reach. I mean, what is it, the journey of 1,000 miles? You take the first step, and the second step's easier. Now, the mystery of Andrew Sue is reduced when you learn that Andrew is homeschooled. Just as John Stuart Mill, the biographer of liberty, was homeschooled, and the inventor of artificial intelligence, Norbert Wiener at MIT, was homeschooled too. Training fleas by first breaking their wills by confinement has been a precision skill for over 2,000 years, a favorite amusement of kings and courts. How far back it goes, I don't know, but I do know this. The secrets it reveals have been known to the policy classes for several millennia, long before we got forced schooling. The effects were known, and the tactics to reach those effects. What was missing was a respectable scientific explanation why the population has to be treated like trapped fleas. Powerful people, of course, have never lacked for justifications for cruelty. But as I told you this morning, and I'm going to go over a little bit of the same ground because it's so vitally important, as one millennium gave way to the other, stronger and stronger evidence had to be produced for treating people like trapped fleas. You couldn't simply claim it was God's will to do that. And during the last 41 years of the 19th century, using insights drawn from animal training, a fabulously wealthy individual, a fabulously